Police laughed at the old man's story. Then they found out he was FBI. Listen, old-timer, we don't have time for your conspiracy theories. Officer Jake Martinez rolled his eyes as the elderly man sitting across from him tried to explain what he'd witnessed. The 73-year-old looked like any other confused senior citizen, wearing a faded cardigan, thick glasses, and speaking in a shaky voice about suspicious activities at the warehouse. But when the serial killer they'd been hunting for months walked right into their trap, those same officers discovered that the crazy old man had been tracking the most dangerous criminal in the state, and he'd been doing it for the FBI. The Riverside Police Department's main precinct buzzed with its usual afternoon activity. Patrol officers filed reports, detectives worked phones, and the coffee machine worked overtime, fueling the constant motion of law enforcement. It was exactly 2:47 p.m. when Walter Grayson shuffled through the front doors, moving with the careful steps of someone whose body had accumulated 8 decades of wear. Walter cut an unremarkable figure, thin and slightly stooped, wearing clothes that had seen better years. His cardigan was patched at the elbows, his slacks were pressed but faded, and his white sneakers had the practical look of shoes chosen for comfort rather than style. Behind thick bifocal glasses, his eyes held an alertness that seemed at odds with his frail appearance. But no one at the desk bothered to look closely enough to notice. Officer Martinez was having a particularly frustrating day. 2 domestic disturbance calls, a fender bender with an uninsured driver, and now this. Another elderly citizen convinced they'd witnessed something sinister. At 28, Martinez had been on the force for 5 years and had developed a particular weariness when it came to senior citizens and their important observations about neighborhood activities. "Can I help you, sir?" Martinez asked with barely concealed impatience as Walter approached his desk. "I need to report suspicious activity," Walter said quietly, his voice carrying the slight tremor that comes with age. "At the old Riverside warehouse on Industrial Boulevard." Martinez sighed internally. The warehouse district was a frequent source of complaints from older residents, who seemed to think every delivery truck was part of some criminal conspiracy. "What kind of suspicious activity?" Martinez asked, already reaching for a standard incident report form. Walter reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting in blue ink. "I've been observing the warehouse for 3 weeks. There's been a pattern of unusual vehicle movements, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Same license plates, different routes each time." Martinez glanced at the notebook with skeptical amusement. "Mr. Grayson, Walter Grayson. Mr. Grayson, are you saying you've been staying up all night to watch an empty warehouse?" The question carried an obvious implication, that Walter might be suffering from the kind of mental confusion that sometimes affected the elderly. Walter nodded seriously. "I have insomnia. I walk at night. And that warehouse isn't empty." He opened his notebook to a page covered with license plate numbers, times, and detailed observations. "These vehicles are being used for body disposal. The pattern matches the timeline of the Riverside killer's activities." The mention of the Riverside killer caused Martinez to look up sharply. The serial killer had been terrorizing the city for 8 months, leaving 5 victims with no apparent connection except for their brutal deaths. The case had consumed hundreds of hours of detective work and FBI resources, with no significant leads. Martinez studied Walter's earnest face and felt a familiar mixture of pity and annoyance. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but the Riverside killer investigation is being handled by federal authorities and our detective division. If you've seen actual criminal activity, I can take a report. but I can't file conspiracy theories." Walter's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. "Officer Martinez, I'm not asking you to solve the case. I'm asking you to verify what I've documented." Before Martinez could respond, Detective Sarah Chen approached his desk. Chen was the department's liaison to the FBI task force hunting the Riverside killer, and she'd overheard the conversation. At 35, she was known for her thoroughness and her ability to see patterns others missed. "What's this about the killer?" she asked Martinez. "This gentleman thinks he's been watching the killer's dumping ground," Martinez explained, his tone making it clear what he thought of Walter's claims. Chen looked at Walter with professional interest rather than dismissal. "Can you show me what you've observed, sir?" Walter handed her his notebook, and Chen began reading with growing attention. The observations were detailed, systematic, and showed a level of analytical thinking that surprised her. License plates, vehicle descriptions, timing patterns, and behavioral notes about the subjects Walter had observed. "This is very thorough work," Chen said slowly. "What's your background, Mr. Grayson?" "I'm retired," Walter answered simply. Chen pressed further. "Retired from what?" Walter hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Security work." Martinez snorted quietly. "Mall security, probably," he muttered to a nearby officer, loud enough for Walter to hear. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a 15-year veteran who supervised the department's major crimes unit. Hayes was stressed, frustrated, and running on too much coffee and too little sleep. The Riverside killer case was destroying his clearance rate and drawing unwanted attention from city officials. "Chen, we need to talk," Hayes said brusquely, then noticed Walter. "Who's this?" "Mr. Grayson has some information about the Riverside case," Chen explained carefully. Hayes looked Walter up and down, taking in his elderly appearance and modest clothes. "What kind of information?" When Chen showed him Walter's notebook, Hayes flipped through it quickly, his expression growing more skeptical with each page. "Look, I appreciate elderly citizens wanting to help, but we can't chase every theory from someone who watches too much CSI. We've got actual leads to follow." The dismissal was complete and public. Several officers within earshot chuckled, and Walter's face flushed with embarrassment. "Lieutenant Hayes," Walter said quietly, "I understand your skepticism, but 3 people are going to die in the next 48 hours if you don't investigate that warehouse." The precision of the prediction caused a momentary silence. Hayes stared at Walter with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "How could you possibly know that?" Walter met his gaze steadily. "Because I've been tracking this killer for 6 months, and his pattern is accelerating. He's entering the final phase of his cycle." The confidence in his voice was unsettling, but Hayes had heard too many false leads to be impressed by apparent certainty. "Mr. Grayson, I'm going to ask you to leave now. If you have actual evidence of a crime, photos, witnesses, physical proof, bring it back. But we don't have time for guesswork." The humiliation was complete. Every officer within hearing distance had witnessed the old man's theories being dismissed by the department's senior detective. Walter slowly closed his notebook, stood up with careful dignity, and walked toward the exit. As he reached the door, he turned back and spoke just loudly enough for the room to hear. "When you find the next victim, remember that someone tried to warn you." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving an uncomfortable silence in the squad room. Officer Martinez shrugged and returned to his paperwork. Detective Chen stared thoughtfully at the door, something nagging at her mind. Lieutenant Hayes grabbed his coffee and headed back to his office, already forgetting the encounter. But 36 hours later, everything changed. The call came in at 6:23 a.m. A jogger had discovered a body in Riverside Park, displayed in the same ritualistic manner as the previous victims. Hayes arrived at the scene to find FBI Special Agent Victoria Nash already examining the crime scene. Nash was the federal task force leader, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for solving impossible cases. "This is victim number 6, Nash said grimly as Hayes approached. "The pattern is escalating. We're running out of time to stop him." Hayes nodded, the stress evident in his face. "Any new leads from the federal analysis?" Nash shook her head. "Nothing concrete, although." She paused, consulting her notes. "We did receive an interesting tip from someone claiming to have been tracking the killer's activities." "A tip?" Hayes asked. "From who?" "Someone who sent detailed surveillance notes to our field office. License plates, vehicle movements, location analysis. Whoever sent it has been conducting a professional-level investigation." Nash handed Hayes a copy of the report. "The observations match our behavioral profile perfectly." "This isn't amateur hour. Someone with serious experience put this together." Hayes studied the documents, his expression changing as he recognized the handwriting and format. This was the same notebook Walter Grayson had shown him 2 days earlier. The same meticulous observations, the same analytical approach. His stomach tightened as he realized what this meant. "Agent Nash," he said slowly, "I think I know who sent you this information, and I think I may have made a serious mistake." Back at the precinct, Hayes called an emergency meeting of everyone who had been present during Walter's visit. Officer Martinez, Detective Chen, and several patrol officers gathered in the conference room as Hayes explained the situation. "The federal task force has confirmed that the information provided by Mr. Grayson shows professional-level investigative work," Hayes began. "They want to meet with him immediately." Martinez looked confused. "The old guy with the notebook? I thought we decided he was just a neighborhood busybody." "That old guy may have been conducting surveillance that we should have taken seriously," Hayes replied grimly. "If you're enjoying this incredible story of how law enforcement learned to never judge someone by their appearance, make sure to subscribe for more amazing veteran stories like this one." Detective Chen spoke up. "I tried to follow up on his information after he left, but we don't have contact information for him. Walter Grayson isn't in our database." Agent Nash entered the conference room, having driven directly from the crime scene. "We need to locate this Walter Grayson immediately. The intel he provided has broken the case open. Our analysts believe he's identified the killer's base of operations." Hayes felt his stomach drop. "Agent Nash, I need to tell you something. Mr. Grayson came here 2 days ago with this exact information. We dismissed him." The silence that followed was deafening. Nash stared at Hayes with an expression that mixed disbelief and professional anger. "You dismissed him? Someone conducting professional-level surveillance on a serial killer?" "He looked like—" Hayes began, then stopped, realizing how his words would sound. "He looked like what, detective?" Nash's voice was dangerously quiet, like an elderly civilian. "We get a lot of false tips from senior citizens who think they've witnessed crimes. I made a judgment call." Nash pulled out her phone and made a quick call. "I need a background check on Walter Grayson, any variations of the name, cross-referenced with federal law enforcement databases." She listened for a moment, then her expression changed completely. "Run that again," she said into the phone. After a few minutes, Nash hung up and turned to face the assembled officers. Walter Thomas Grayson, retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent, 32 years with the Bureau, specialization in behavioral analysis and serial killer investigations. He was the lead profiler on the Green River Killer case, the Atlanta child murders, and the East Coast Strangler. The room went dead silent. He retired 8 years ago with the highest commendations for investigative excellence, Nash continued. His work resulted in the capture and conviction of 17 serial killers. He's literally one of the most experienced manhunters in American law enforcement history. Officer Martinez felt sick. We treated him like he was senile. You treated one of the most qualified people in the country to catch this killer like he was a confused old man, Nash said coldly. And now we need to find him before we lose our best chance to stop the Riverside Killer. The search for Walter began immediately. Detective Chen canvassed the neighborhood around the warehouse district, showing his description to local business owners and residents. Other officers checked hospital records, senior centers, and retirement communities. It was Chen who finally found him, sitting on a park bench near Riverside Park, feeding pigeons from a small bag of breadcrumbs. He looked exactly as he had 2 days earlier, elderly, modest, unremarkable. But now she saw him differently. The careful way he observed his surroundings, the systematic pattern in which he scattered the breadcrumbs, the alert intelligence in his eyes behind the thick glasses. Mr. Grayson, she approached carefully. I'm Detective Chen from Riverside PD. We met briefly 2 days ago. Walter looked up with mild surprise. Detective Chen, I remember. Have you come to arrest me for interfering with an investigation? There was no bitterness in his voice, just weary resignation. Actually, I've come to apologize, Chen said, sitting down beside him on the bench. And to ask for your help. The FBI would like to speak with you. Walter studied her face, looking for signs of another dismissal or trick. The FBI already has my report. I sent it to Agent Nash after your department made it clear my observations weren't welcome. Mr. Grayson, Chen said carefully, we didn't know about your background. If we had known you were a retired federal agent. Walter shook his head. Detective, my background shouldn't matter. Either the evidence I presented was valid, or it wasn't. Either the observations were worth investigating, or they weren't. My resume doesn't change the facts. Chen realized he was absolutely right, and the truth stung. You're right. We should have taken your information seriously regardless of who you were. That's good police work. And we failed. Walter continued feeding the pigeons, but she could see he was listening. The Bureau wants to work with you on the case. Agent Nash says your profile of the killer is the most accurate they've seen. I'm retired, Detective. I came forward as a citizen reporting suspicious activity. That's all. But Chen could see the spark of professional interest in his eyes. Mr. Grayson, there's going to be another victim tonight unless we stop him. You know that, don't you? Walter was quiet for a long moment. Yes. He's accelerating because he knows someone is watching. My surveillance spooked him. Then help us catch him, Chen said simply. 3 more people will die if we don't. Walter looked at the pigeons, then at Chen, then at the notebook she knew he kept in his pocket. Finally, he nodded. All right, Detective. But this time, we do it right. The Task Force Command Center had been set up in the FBI's field office, with Walter's surveillance data covering an entire wall. Maps, photographs, timeline charts, and behavioral analysis filled every available surface. Agent Nash briefed the assembled team of federal agents and local police officers, with Walter sitting quietly in the corner, looking like someone's grandfather who had wandered into the wrong meeting. Based on Mr. Grayson's observations, Nash began, we believe the suspect uses the Riverside warehouse as a staging area. He brings victims there, performs his rituals, then transports the bodies to display locations throughout the city. She pointed to Walter's meticulous timeline. The pattern shows he's moved from monthly kills to weekly, and now he's operating on a 48-hour cycle. Officer Martinez, who had been included in the briefing, kept glancing at Walter with obvious discomfort. The elderly man who had seemed so harmless and confused now sat listening to tactical plans with the focused attention of someone who had done this many times before. During a break in the briefing, Martinez approached Walter hesitantly. "Mr. Grayson," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to dismiss what you were telling us." Walter looked at the young officer with understanding rather than anger. "Officer Martinez, you did what most people would do. I don't look like someone who hunts serial killers for a living." "But you are someone who hunts serial killers," Martinez said. "Or you were." "I was," Walter agreed. "For 32 years. But that was a long time ago. Things change. People retire. They get old." He adjusted his glasses and smiled slightly. "Sometimes they just look like confused old men." Martinez realized this was exactly the point. How many times did people underestimate you because of how you looked? "More often than you'd think," Walter replied. "It was actually useful in the field. Suspects would talk to me because I looked harmless. Witnesses would open up because I reminded them of their grandfather. Sometimes the best disguise is just being invisible." The tactical plan was elegantly simple. Walter's surveillance had identified the killer's pattern of vehicle movements and timing. The task force would establish observation points around the warehouse and wait for him to arrive for what Walter's analysis predicted would be his next victim acquisition. At 11:47 p.m., exactly when Walter's timeline predicted, a dark sedan pulled into the warehouse parking lot. Through night vision scopes, the surveillance team watched as a man matching their suspect profile entered the building. "This is it," Agent Nash whispered into her radio. "All units, suspect is in the building. Move to containment positions." The arrest was anticlimactic compared to the months of investigation that preceded it. Marcus Henley, a 34-year-old maintenance worker, surrendered without resistance when surrounded by federal agents. In his vehicle and in the warehouse, they found evidence linking him to all 6 murders, along with plans for future victims that matched Walter's prediction exactly. The case that had stumped dozens of experienced investigators for 8 months was solved because an elderly retiree had taken the time to observe, analyze, and report what he'd seen. The same man who had been dismissed as a confused senior citizen had provided the breakthrough that ended the Riverside killer's spree. In the days that followed, the story made national news. The footage of Walter being escorted into the FBI building for debriefing contrasted sharply with the earlier security camera video of him being dismissed from the police station. The headline in the local paper read, "Retired FBI agent solves serial killer case. After police dismiss him as confused old man." Lieutenant Hayes faced an internal review of his handling of Walter's initial report. He wasn't fired, but the incident became a case study in the department's training program about the importance of properly evaluating all citizen reports, regardless of the source. Officer Martinez requested to be part of the team developing new protocols for handling elderly witnesses and tipsters. Detective Chen was promoted to the FBI task force and worked directly with Walter on 3 additional cases over the following year. She learned more about investigative technique from him in those cases than she had in her previous 10 years of police work. Agent Nash wrote a formal commendation for Walter's work on the Riverside killer case, noting that his civilian surveillance had been more effective than the combined efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies. But perhaps the most important lesson was learned by the officers who had been present during Walter's first visit to the station. They began to understand that expertise comes in many forms, and that experience doesn't always announce itself with obvious credentials. The elderly man in the faded cardigan had been more qualified to solve their case than anyone else in the room, but they had been unable to see past his age and appearance. Walter returned to his quiet retirement, but his phone rang regularly with calls from law enforcement agencies facing unsolved cases. He never refused a request for help, understanding that his knowledge represented a resource that shouldn't be wasted. The notebook he carried was replaced by a small laptop, but his approach remained the same: careful observation, systematic analysis, and the patience to see patterns others missed. Today, there's a small plaque in the Riverside Police Department lobby, placed there by the officers who learned the most important lesson of their careers from an elderly man they almost ignored. It reads simply, "Listen to every voice. You never know which one will solve your case." The lesson of Walter Grayson serves as a reminder that in law enforcement, as in life, assumptions based on appearance can be dangerously wrong. The most qualified expert in the room might be the one who looks the least like what you expect an expert to look like. And sometimes, the solution to your biggest problem walks through your front door, wearing a cardigan and thick glasses, carrying nothing but a notebook and the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent catching the uncatchable.